What's up, Covalence friends? Today, we're going to be going over yet another common JavaScript mistake that I see a lot of developers make, from beginners all the way to advanced developers. It's easy to kind of mess up and just oversee, and it has to do with promises and the way that people usually fetch data. So let's get right into it. All right, so we're starting off with a really basic repo here. We have our index.html, which links to an app.css and also an app.js. And all we have in here is an empty div. And so basically all we're going to be doing here is we're going to be running some JavaScript code. We're going to basically be living in the app.js, but we're going to be running some JavaScript code, and then we're going to be posting a timestamp into this div. And the app.css is basically just styling that div, so it's very simple. But you can go ahead if you need to. The link to this repo is in the description below, so feel free to pull it and just use the code and play around with it. But again, like I said, we're going to be living within this app.js, which again, I have some pre-written code here, but it's pretty simple. All we're doing is we have our immediately executed function, and we're grabbing that div, which is the only div in the page. And then we have a get data function, which is basically just simulating some kind of get data, right? So any type of fetch to a server, but we're basically just doing a set timeout, and we can pass in a delay in milliseconds. And that's going to basically just simulate a timeout where it's getting data, right? And then we have our main function that we're running, and all it's doing is it's getting a timestamp to start. We're going to fetch some code, or our fetch code, I guess you could say, and then we're going to get an end timestamp. And so the meat of our code is going to be in here. But basically, regardless of what kind of app you're writing, almost every page you're going to be grabbing data from an API of some kind. And so what you want to do here is think about, what could be happening when you go to a page. So a lot of times you might grab a user, then you might grab some sort of data model, right? There we go. And then you might start grabbing some auxiliary data models, right? Which are based off of some kind of an ID. So let's just say it's, the model ID. Let's say it's a tweet of some kind, right? And so you're grabbing the tweet page, and you're going to grab the user for yourself. You're also going to grab the tweet itself that was obtained from an ID that was passed into the URL. And then you might have some auxiliary data models like comments, things like that are based on that tweet, right? And so these data models, you don't technically need this data model first, right? Because you have the tweet ID. And so you want to grab all comments that are associated with that tweet ID, right? And so a lot of times what we'll see is we'll see somebody come in, they'll grab the user, so they'll await this. Let's just say it takes, 1.5 seconds, and then they'll grab the tweet. So we're going to await get data, and it's going to be, let's just say 1350, let's say, right? And then we're also going to grab the auxiliary comments, right? And let's say this just takes 1 second flat, right? So, and then they display the page, right? So they're actually setting all their data at this point, and they're grabbing the page, they're actually grabbing the models, and then they're setting the model values in the DOM, right? And so basically we will now run this. So we want to pull this up, and you can see nothing's happening. And then finally, bam, 3.872 seconds later, we finish grabbing all of our data, right? And so that's kind of a while. I mean, you could show a spinner, right? You could show some sort of loading indicator, but 3.872 seconds is fairly long time, right? I mean, just to kind of show a spinner. So the issue here is that we're wasting a lot of time, and I feel like await code makes this a little bit harder to understand. Back when await didn't exist yet, I feel like less people made this mistake, but now that everybody's kind of learning with async await style code, I feel like people just end up writing code like this, and it's not efficient whatsoever. So what we really want to do is we want to actually call the functions that aren't dependent on one another. Now, sometimes this function might be dependent on this function, right? At which case this really is an all right way to do it, because you might be grabbing a variable, var d equals await, and then in here we might be passing in, d.value or something like that, right? But let me just make sure that's the exact same, because before we had 3.872, right? But again, this is not the case in this particular situation, and you should know, right? You should get good at being able to figure out if what data you need to grab the data that you need, if that makes sense. That was a little confusing, but yes, you should know which functions are dependent on other functions and which data is dependent on other data, right? In this case, we're going to simulate the fact that none of these are dependent on one another. And so what you want to do instead of just calling await get user, await get data model, and await get auxiliary data models, you'll just set a variable here. So you'll say const uprom equals get data, and we're not doing the await, obviously. We'll say const dprom equals get data, and const aprom equals get data, right? And so what we're saying is that these are actually now promises. So we're not awaiting each particular one, we're just getting the data here, right? And then what you can do here is now you can just say await uprom, await dprom, and await aprom. All right, awesome. So now we're going to simply call each promise. Each of these is going to fire immediately, right? So we're going to just fire this, fire this, fire this. We're not going to be waiting anything, and then we're going to wait for this to finish. We're then going to wait for this to finish, and then we're going to wait for this to finish, right? So should be fine. And we're now going to rerun this, and you can see 1.5 seconds, and we're done, right? So half the time, you saved yourself a significant amount of time on the page load. And the code doesn't look as nice, unfortunately, but right, sometimes we need to trade off efficiency and whatnot. And if you wanted to change this up, what you can do is my personal preference, which is even better. You could await a promise.all, and you could just put all your promises in here. And this is also extremely helpful as well, because when you do like this, you can actually have an array that you're then just pushing the data to. So again, if you don't even need to do this, what you could do is you could have a const. Well, let's just run this first to make sure it works. All right, 1.509. It says it took a little bit longer, which might be the case simply because of the promise.all call, but that 9,000ths of a second is not going to be a big performance indicator. No user is going to notice the difference between 9,000ths of a second. And that honestly could have something to do just with the computer clock. And so that's a negligible difference in this case. But again, the nice thing about using promise.all is that you could just have a const, proms, let's just say, as an array. And then instead of all of these, you're just proms.push, right? I mean, you don't even need to push these, to be honest, right? You could just do something like this, where we're simply putting the promises inside of the array to begin with, right? And then you could just move your comments if you need to. So you can say, grab user. And then we're just doing a promise.all on the proms, right? And so you could even you don't even need this variable, to be honest. You could just honestly pull all of this right into here. And you now have all of your fetch code inside your await promise.all, where you're grabbing all the data. And if you needed to grab this, each individual item after this, you would have your const, could be user, DM, and ADM, right? So you have your user, your data model, and your auxiliary data model all right here. If you need to do something with it after. But if you now run this, right, you have that 1.5 seconds still, which is the fastest way to do it. And everything looks clean, it's simple, and you know what's going on here. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope you learned a little something. Some of you might have already realized this, but again, I notice this all the time, and I'll have people who've been coding for 10 years still make this mistake. And so, again, just make sure that when you're writing your code, you're very conscious of it. And especially with the way that things work with async and await style code, like it just sometimes is easy to serialize these things. And there is a cost to it, right? And so make sure you want your code to be as efficient as possible. You want loading times to be as fast as possible for your users. So highly recommend you look at your code, even go back and look at some of the code you've already written, make sure that you're doing this correctly. So if you have any additional questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. Otherwise, make sure that you subscribe and check out our merch store, which is also in the description below. And if you have any suggestions for future content, feel free to let us know. Otherwise, we'll be seeing you soon.